Adolf Hitler's meteoric rise from uneducated nobody to the leader of a tyrannical empire was fueled by ruthless ambition and strategic manipulation.
He was the ultimate white supremacist.
Supported by brutal paramilitary forces, an entourage of fanatical followers, and the mythology of powerful propaganda, Hitler became the self-appointed savior of Germany. A ruthless warlord touting grand architectural plans and impossible dreams.
Hitler saw himself as having a destiny. He saw himself as a man of destiny.
In Hitler's vision for his 1,000-year Reich, he was viewing it as on par with the Roman Empire or ancient Greece, and he wanted his monuments to rival, if not outshine, those monuments.
And underneath the complex web of power, loyalty, and deception that defined Hitler's tyrannical reign lie deep personal secrets that not only shaped Adolf Hitler's despotic rule, they changed world history forever.
Die Bedeutung des Dritten Reiches für die Weltgeschichte war groß. Noch heute in Deutschland ist es so, dass diese Erinnerung an dieses verbrecherische, mörderische Regime unser politisches Handeln bestimmt.
History regards Adolf Hitler as a loner, a ruthless dictator who commanded total obedience from those below him.
Das waren Leute, die ihm nicht widersprachen. Die brauchte er zur Bestätigung seiner eigenen Meinung und um sein lebenslang angekränkeltes Selbstbewusstsein zu bestätigen. Widersprechen dem Diktator war gefährlich.
The Third Reich was governed according to the Führerprinzip. One leader, Adolf Hitler, a Führer with undisputed authority. But Hitler's rule would not have been possible without the support of the people, organizations and groups that made his tyranny and his war possible.
Hitler wurde möglich durch ein Justiz- und Politikversagen. Wir dürfen nicht den Fehler machen, die Geschichte von hinten zu betrachten. Hier dürfen wir nicht den Fehler machen, ihn da schon als den großen Führer zu sehen. Die ganzen frühen 20er Jahre hindurch ist Hitler eine rein lokale Größe.
And the foundational pillar that Hitler needed to prop up his reign was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Emerging from defeat in World War I, Germany was chaotic. Monarchic dynasties that had ruled for centuries were discarded. Germans were told that their country would now be governed by the democratic Weimar Republic.
Wir haben hier eine Nachkriegsgesellschaft, eine Transformationsgesellschaft. Hungerunruhen, die Stadt war voll mit zurückgekehrten Soldaten, die keine Arbeit hatten, waren arbeitslos, sie hatten keine Wohnungen, sie hungerten.
We have the complete breakdown of the monarchical order. The Kaiser was put onto a train and marched off to the Netherlands to live out the rest of his life.
In the ensuing confusion, opposing fringe groups rose up to stake out territories. Violence was the order of the day, with running battles in the streets.
We have well over 50 of these very small splinter groups, all attempting to coax members of the public into their radical nationalism.
Adolf Hitler returned to Munich after World War I, where he'd served as a dispatch runner in a Bavarian regiment. He was 30 years old, and without any formal education or career prospects, he chose to stay in the army.
1919 meldete sich Hitler für die Propagandaeinheit der Bayerischen Reichswehr, die gerade eben erst ins Leben gerufen wurde, und unter Hauptmann Karl Mayer agierte und deren Aufgabe war, bolschewistische Umtriebe unter den Soldaten zu verhindern.
One fringe group on the army's watch list was the DAP, or German Workers' Party. Founded by locksmith Anton Drexler, it was a small right-wing nationalist group with only a few dozen members that habitually held meetings in the beer halls of Bavaria.
Das waren Eisenbahnmitarbeiter, die sich dort zusammenfanden. Sie waren unzufrieden, natürlich mit dem verlorenen Krieg, dem ökonomischen Niedergang, dass man den Versailler Vertrag unterschreiben musste, dass man im Grunde gedemütigt war vor aller Welt als allein Kriegsschuld. Also man kann sich vorstellen, die Stimmung war schlecht in diesem Bierhall.
It's in this context that Hitler goes into the meeting of the DAP and he's incensed when he hears one of the speakers talking about the prospects for Bavarian separatism, the idea that Bavaria would be its own state. And so he gets out of his chair and says an enormously long and, by some accounts, very impressive speech in favour of a united Germany. In his eyes, Germany is hamstrung by a number of internal and external enemies. In particular, communists, socialists and trade unionists, but also racial others, particularly Jews, but also Roma, Sinti, and those he sees as inferior in the East, Slavic peoples.
Anton Drexler was impressed. This unknown corporal was a captivating, if unsophisticated speaker, ready to voice sentiments that Drexler and his fringe party shared, but were too afraid to express themselves. Believing that he would be able to control Hitler, Drexler invited him to join the DAP.
Hitler-Anhänger, Bewunderer an, die in ihm eine Alternative zur bestehenden politischen Situation sahen. Es war schon lange so, schon im Grunde seit der Jahrhundertwende, dass man in Deutschland von einem Führer träumte. Nach Ende der Monarchie und mit den ganzen politischen und wirtschaftlichen Problemen kam dieser Führergedanke wieder auf, dass man einen Führer aus dem Volk wollte.
Adolf Hitler believed he was this leader, and he saw the DAP as the supporting pillar in achieving his aim.
I think it's fair to say that even in the early days, even in the beer hall days, Hitler sees himself as a dictator, albeit a dictator of his own party.
Hitler set out to make the DAP matter, and to make it his. That put him at odds with Drexler and the rest of the party leadership.
There was some discussions over joining with another organisation, and eventually Hitler stormed out and said, well, I'm resigning. And they realised by this stage that they needed him. They couldn't let him go.
Derjenige, der die Massen anzieht. Und so kommt es dann tatsächlich dazu, dass Hitler im Juli 1921 Vorsitzender der Nationalsozialistischen Deutschen Arbeiterpartei wird.
Understanding Hitler's path from political nobody to party leader is key to decoding his forthcoming dictatorship. At his suggestion, the DAP was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. Governed by the Führerprinzip, it became the main pillar upon which Hitler's vision and ambition would balance.
From this point on, you really see Hitler demanding firm and full control over his party, and eventually he will extend this demand for full and firm control over all of Germany.
Having bullied his way to leader of the fledgling Nazi Party, Hitler set out to convince the German public that he was their best hope for a better future. Supported by party propaganda, a cult of personality was built around him, positioning him as the savior of the German nation.
The cult of personality is really important. It draws on a number of things that already exist in German nationalism, and particularly in right-wing German nationalism. It's the idea that a great man can embody the future of Germany. And it is very much aimed at overturning democracy in Germany.
The primary weapon in Hitler's arsenal was his gift for public speaking.
Hitler also found the power of the spoken word absolutely intoxicating. And here too, he could find a central pillar of his power through his speech, through the power of the spoken word.
So what he did was create a voice for public consumption. Guttural, slightly rasping, slightly staccato.
Es sei, und dies ist unser unbändiger Wille.
It's an immense power coming from a relatively small body.
Bitterliches Gericht zu halten, unser deutsches Vaterland, unser deutsches Volk.
Hitler's genius for public speaking was multifaceted. By promising to restore Germany's pride and former glory, Hitler told the German population what they wanted to hear.
Hitler says in Mein Kampf, we're not speaking to the intelligentsia, we're speaking to the masses. And it has to be simple, it has to be direct, it has to be multiply repeated. And it's a meld not just of the power of the language, but actually the physical dramaturgy of the act. It's how he acts it out with his bodily performance. This is the heart of what Hitler offered. He made politics exciting, arousing, entertaining.
Vergiss 14 Jahre Verfall und hebe dich empor zu 2000 Jahren deutscher Geschichte.
The late 1920s was also a time of great technological advancement, which the Nazi Party leveraged to build the pillars of the Hitler phenomenon. First among these was the PA system loudspeaker, known back then as electro-acoustical magnification.
And this changes everything. He's not having to use a loud hailer. You have great bags of electronically augmented loudspeakers everywhere. And so everyone can hear the message. No one is straining to hear the message. It makes the mass rally possible. It makes Nuremberg possible.
14 Jahre lang haben diese Parteien die deutsche Freiheit vergewaltigt, den deutschen Menschen geknebelt und geschlagen. 2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir Nationalsozialisten!
In the early 1930s, consumer radios were still a luxury item. For the Nazi shrewd master of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, created a radio cheap enough that every German worker could own one. The result was the Volksempfänger, or low-price people's receiver.
This is absolutely critical. 9 months after attaining power, they have a cheap mass-produced radio, and they later bring out a smaller, even cheaper version, so that the entire country is wired up. But it's wired up in a particular way. You can only get the Nazi and government broadcasts. You can't get foreign broadcasts on this radio.
The number of radio listeners rose from 10,000 in 1924 to 4 million by 1932. And by the middle of 1939, 70% of German households had radios, the highest percentage in the world.
They learned to understand the medium, to flatter it, to use it, to exploit it. Goebbels has a switch in his office where he can just tap into any broadcast going on at the time and speak to the entire German nation that is listening.
By utilizing a combination of newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, rallies, and posters to glorify Hitler as a visionary leader, the Nazi propaganda machine was an incredibly modern and effective pillar of power. But to fortify their flourishing rise, the ambitious Nazi Party needed paramilitary support.
One of the markers of fascism is a belief in the efficacy and the value of violence. That violence is one of the ways in which you express your will. It weeds out the weak, it gets rid of your enemies. And early on, Hitler is very much thinking about the transformation of German politics as one of a violent overthrow of the existing regime.
In the early Weimar Republic, fighting between opposing street armies, or Freikorps, was rampant. Arriving in Bavaria, Hitler was impressed by the right-wing clashes with communist militias, and in particular by the violent tactics of a group of former soldiers known as stormtroopers, led by decorated World War I veteran Ernst Röhm.
Also Ernst Röhm legt geheime Waffenlager an und träumt schon lange von einem Putsch. Er gehört zu den Ersten, die Hitler unterstützten. Er war auch ein extremer Antisemit. Er hasste die Weimarer Republik. Und er sah in Hitler den extremsten Bekämpfer dieser Weimarer Demokratie. Röhm ist derjenige, der Hitler zu Beziehungen in die Reichswehr verhilft. Er wird ja auch nicht umsonst Maschinengewehrkönig von München genannt.
Hitler and Röhm became fast friends, and Röhm's stormtroopers under the banner of the SA became the paramilitary pillar of the early Nazi Party.
We see that Röhm becomes responsible for ensuring that the SA is able to push Nazism out onto the streets of Germany. The SA, in effect, made it dangerous to oppose the Nazi Party. The SA publicly attacks trade unionists, socialists, but also Jews and others they feel are undesirable in German society.
Bolstered by this pillar of violence, in November of 1923, Hitler convinced the celebrated war hero General Erich Ludendorff to join him and the SA in a coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch.
Hitler rallies his SA and says this is the moment we will seize power by force, in the same way that Mussolini had done in Italy. Now, does this violence work? In short, no. Hitler is tried as a criminal for having tried to overthrow the state.
Aus dem Fehlschlag des Putsches lernte Hitler, dass man jetzt nicht an den Strukturen, an den politischen Strukturen vorbei den Staat zu Fall bringen kann. Man muss im Grunde die Demokratie unterwandern, indem man sich in Parlamente wählen lässt. Und genau das taten die Nazis dann auch.
Hitler and the Nazis had far more success manipulating democratic processes. They capitalized on the 1929 New York stock market collapse and turned the Great Depression and ensuing fear and uncertainty into a popularity bonanza. And in the September 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party won 107 seats, becoming the second largest party in Germany. But Hitler wanted more. So he strategically deployed the SA to foster a climate of fear and intimidation across Germany.
This can involve crashing into socialist and trade union headquarters and attacking the people that live there, looting and plundering the party offices of the Social Democrats and others, and ensuring that there is a climate of fear that surrounds attacks on Nazi Party messages and the Nazi Party itself.
It was a fiendishly shrewd, destabilizing strategy. And it worked, paving the way for Hitler's rise to power. On January 30, 1933, Reich President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. He was still an Austrian, and only now would become a German citizen.
So the period between Hitler's putsch attempt and him coming to power sees Hitler's most concerted attempt to use democracy in order to bring about a non-democratic state. Once he has arrived in power, he turns once again to coercion and violence to ensure that nobody can remove the Nazi Party from power.
Within weeks of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, a fire destroyed the Reichstag Parliament building. A Dutch communist was beheaded for arson, and Hitler and the SA leveraged this as an excuse to perpetrate more violence. There were more than 460 street battles, in which 400 people were seriously injured. 80 were killed. In the stirred-up agitation that followed, the Nazi Party forced through two emergency measures: the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act, bringing an end to democratic freedoms and processes, and granting Hitler control over the economy, the media, and the judiciary.
Once the Enabling Act is passed, Germany is effectively a dictatorship, and Hitler is the dictator.
Violence and intimidation were the strengthening pillars of the party state. But when the battle of the streets had been won, the SA remained, and their sheer numbers and reckless discipline became a threat to stability.
So in many ways, the SA are so successful in what they do as a paramilitary force supporting the Nazi Party that they become, in effect, a rival to the standing German army. Now, this rival is seen with great alarm by the German army, who effectively offer Hitler an ultimatum. Either you support us, or we will deal with the SA ourselves. Ultimately, Hitler has no choice but to accede to the wishes of the German army.
This was the opportunity for the SS, Adolf Hitler's fanatically loyal personal bodyguard, to cement its role as a pillar of tyranny.
So when we're considering Nazi violence, on the one hand, we have the crude mass violence of the SA. But alongside that, we also have to think about the sophisticated, highly concerted and well-aimed violence of the SS. The SS, if you like, is the tip of the Nazi spear.
The SS were led by Heinrich Himmler, an ambitious early supporter of Hitler, who would replace Ernst Röhm and become the second most powerful person in the Third Reich.
Bis zur Nacht der langen Messer war Heinrich Himmler ja Ernst Röhm unterstellt. Das heißt, die SA war die große Dachorganisation, unter der sich auch die SS und Himmler persönlich befanden.
But this chain of command was destined to change, as the relationship between Hitler and Röhm soured.
Hitler möchte jetzt ja einen ganz anderen Weg probieren. Er möchte ja nicht mehr als Revolutionär. Hitler will jetzt als demokratischer, während Röhm weiterhin Revolution machen will.
Hitler also had the problem of pacifying the regular army, which had become fearful of the SA. This power struggle ended in a bloody purge, known as the Night of the Long Knives.
Am 30. Juni 1934 beginnt die Nacht der langen Messer. Das heißt, hier beginnt eine Aktion von Göring, Himmler und Hitler, um die SA-Führer zu entmachten, Röhm zu entmachten, aber sich auch innerparteilicher Gegner zu entledigen. Alle, die irgendwann irgendetwas gegen Hitler oder die NSDAP gemacht haben, werden an diesem Tag getötet oder inhaftiert. Es werden ja Tausende, 2000 Menschen ungefähr, wir wissen gar nicht genau wie viel, getötet während dieses Tages und während dieser Nacht.
The victims were branded traitors and mutineers, and Hitler told the Reichstag less than 2 weeks after the killings, "I gave the order to shoot the main culprits." But it was Heinrich Himmler and his black-clad SS who carried out the murders.
The Night of the Long Knives demonstrates that Hitler is not opposed to betraying those closest to him. We see that most vividly in his treatment of Ernst Röhm, who cannot believe, right up until the moment he is executed, that Hitler would do this to him. And in Hitler's mind, political power and violence are intertwined.
As one pillar of tyranny was torn down, another took its place. One that had sworn personal loyalty, not to Germany, but rather to Adolf Hitler.
The power of the SA, the stormtroopers, diminished at the same time as the power of the SS increased rapidly. The SS effectively became a state within a state.
Understanding how the Nazi state within a state supported Hitler is key to understanding his tyrannical reign. And at the head of this shadow state was the Gestapo, the all-powerful and incredibly frightening secret police, led by Heinrich Himmler.
Die Gestapo ist ein Teil der SS. Die Organisation, die für die Sicherheit nicht nur Hitlers zuständig ist, sondern des gesamten Reiches. Also ihr wird letztlich auch die Polizei unterstellt. Eine Gestapo etabliert, um Jagd tatsächlich auf Andersdenkende zu machen, die inneren Feinde, wie es immer hieß, die Kommunisten, Sozialisten, Juden, zu inhaftieren und im Grunde aus der Volksgemeinschaft herauszudrängen.
Himmler and his secret police created a society of fear and suspicion, where neighbor spied on neighbor, and betrayal became a staple of daily life.
The Gestapo used so-called fog and night measures to control German society. They would knock on the door in the middle of the night after having been informed that somebody was against the Nazi Party. Now, this could be because of perceived racial transgressions, perceived disloyal remarks, or because of political dissent against the Nazi Party. The knock on the door from the Gestapo became the most feared aspect of Nazi rule, particularly inside Germany.
The Gestapo were never very large. You don't need many of them because so many people are prepared to betray their neighbor, to declare them ideologically deficient, subversive, and so forth. It turns Germany into a nation of snitches. Children denounce their parents. Your friends, your workmates, your neighbors, they were the police. And this is the critical thing to realize. There are two states in Nazi Germany. There's the formal German state, and there is the SS, who do everything.
Hitler now stood atop a double regime. All government structures under the Weimar Republic and the earlier empire were matched by this competing, contradicting, and undermining party state.
They have the phrase working towards the Führer. What they're doing is struggling to interpret people's will. And since you have competing bureaucracies, they each offer a different bureaucratic and political problem. But Hitler is going around blessing all of it, sprinkling it with his holy water, not really wanting to be bothered. It is the most extraordinary system of government which ever existed.
As inefficient as it was, the leaders of industry had long been advocates for the state that Hitler promised them. After Hitler's stormtroopers violently dismantled the trade union movement, the industrialists were firmly on side.
Genauso wie alle anderen demokratischen Institutionen mussten natürlich auch die Gewerkschaften vereinheitlicht werden, um sie besser zu kontrollieren. Also es wird eine Einheitsgewerkschaft gegründet, die von Robert Ley angeführt wird und der alle anderen Gewerkschaften sich unterordnen müssen. Es ging hier immer darum, etwas zu zentralisieren, die Macht zu zentralisieren, um sie besser kontrollieren zu können.
On August 2nd, 1934, Reich President Paul von Hindenburg died. The Nazi Party held a referendum asking the German people to vote for the roles of Chancellor and President to be combined into a single person. On August 19th, 1934, almost 90% of voters said yes. Adolf Hitler was now the Führer.
One Reich, one Volk, one Führer is the key political idea of the time. And it captures the idea that one man, the Führer, Hitler, can embody the whole nation and is the source of all political decision-making, of all political legitimacy within the nation.
And a Reich that was expected to last 1,000 years needed a pillar that could control young people.
The German youth was an absolutely central part of Hitler's ideology, but also a fundamental pillar of support for the National Socialist state. The Nazis used the classroom then as a way in which to put forward their ideology, kind of disguised as education, because it's taking place in the schools and in the classroom.
If you can win over the youth, you have captured the future of Germany. And so youth activities are hugely important, and propaganda directed at youth are hugely important for the party.
Hitler's belief in controlling every aspect of young people's lives is key to decoding his dictatorship. Youth policy was all about shaping the minds and values of German youth. The school curriculum was rewritten, and membership of Nazi youth movements became compulsory for all German boys and girls.
There was the Deutsches Jungvolk for the boys aged 10 to 14, and then the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, for the older boys 14 to 18. So it meant that all the other different kinds of youth groups were eliminated and in fact illegal. Only the Hitler Youth existed.
And the emphasis was on sporting activities, on camping trips, on hiking, and propaganda. And this kind of emphasis on physical activity and on propaganda to the expense of intellectual activity was a common feature of the education system under the Nazis.
And that was all connected to this ideology of Blut und Boden, or blood and soil, and really going into things like orienteering and preparations for kind of pre-military drills, skills that were going to get these youth ready for war.
Und was wir tun, wir werden vergehen, aber in euch wird Deutschland weiterleben. Und wenn von uns nichts mehr übrig sein wird, dann werden wir die Fahne, die wir einst aus dem Nichts hochgezogen haben, in euren Fäusten halten möchten.
While German boys were being groomed for the military, German girls were expected to play a different, albeit equally important role in the future of the Reich.
The socialization of German girls sort of took place in parallel through the League of German Girls. So the ultimate aim for the young German girl was to become a future mother. So she had to be neat and tidy, she had to be of good health, presented well in her uniform and her hair tidy, no makeup. Very important was physical fitness, because the Nazis believed that fit girls would become fit mothers.
In the classrooms, a crucial pillar of Nazi education was the indoctrination of racial theory.
Children were expected to keep a race book in which they were to collect caricatures and stereotypes of the different races, to consider great men of the past and how their Aryan heritage was manifest in these great individuals, and basically to see the world through the lens of race.
Beyond that, the classroom was used to put forward anti-Semitic ideology, in particular through some very heinous publications, like one called the poisonous mushroom, the gift pills, which shows a mushroom with this kind of very stereotypic image of the Jew. So that's very important too in the establishment of anti-Semitic ideology and in the permeation of youth with those kinds of ideas.
Life under the Third Reich was all about loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi Party, from cradle to grave.
This popular joke that went around in the 1930s, with the father in the SA, the Stormtroopers, the mother in the Frauenschaft, which was the Nazi women's group, the son in the Hitler Youth, and the daughter in the League of German Girls. Where does the ideal Nazi family meet? At the annual rally at Nuremberg. So the family was all about a healthy mother and father giving birth to as many healthy babies as possible.
Die Idee dieses Führerstaates war, dass man eine neue Volksgemeinschaft bildet, das Volk ein. Und hier ging es aber nicht um Inklusion, sondern um Exklusion. Das heißt, zur Volksgemeinschaft durften nur die Arier, die wirklichen Deutschen, gehören.
Hitler's views on race, expressed at length in Mein Kampf, were arguably the most fundamental pillar of his tyrannical reign. The Nazi Party set out a 25-point program that encapsulated its nationalist, racist, authoritarian, and anti-Semitic ideologies. Two central fixtures of this plan were Lebensraum, the creation of living space by taking over eastern territories inhabited by Slavic peoples, whom the Nazis considered inferior, and Judenrein, cleansing Germany of Jews, initially by deportation, and culminating in the Nazis' final solution, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust.
Das nationalsozialistische Regime war ein verbrecherisches, mörderisches Regime. Von Anfang an, seit 1933, wurden politische Gegner, andersdenkende Juden verfolgt, inhaftiert, gefoltert, getötet. Mit Beginn des Krieges fängt nicht nur ein Krieg an, um Gebiete zurückzuerobern, sondern der Krieg ist von Anfang an, seit 1939, auch ein Vernichtungskrieg.
The first concentration camp was opened near the town of Dachau on the 22nd of March 1933 by Heinrich Himmler.
Initially, the concentration camps are aimed at leftists, trade unionists, communists, and socialists. After that, they are aimed at so-called asocial elements, that is to say, the homeless, alcoholics, people who had been identified as disruptive to German society in a very kind of mundane way. But of course, alongside these also came the locking up of Jewish Germans.
For the Jewish population, the end of democracy and the stamping of Nazi authority means a substantial increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks. Those will continue to ramp up during the lifespan of the Nazi regime.
On April 1st, 1933, Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels orchestrated a campaign to boycott Jewish businesses. And in September 1935, during the annual Nuremberg rally, the party introduced the Nuremberg race laws, stripping Jews of their civil rights and citizenships, and banning marriage between Jews and Germans.
This anti-Semitic policy culminated on the 9th of November 1938 in Reichskristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. This night saw unprecedented violence against Germany's Jewish community right across the nation. There were close to 100 deaths that night. There were 20 to 30,000 Jewish men carted off to Nazi concentration camps, as well as the destruction of countless Jewish homes and businesses, and of course, very importantly, the destruction and burning down of nearly every synagogue in the land.
Kristallnacht becomes a real turning point in the intensification of violence and in the direct persecution of Jewish people. But it's presented to the public not as a state action, but as a popular upswelling of anti-Semitism. It wasn't. This was absolutely a government policy.
And so on it goes until you get to the war years, when the answer to the so-called Jewish question becomes one of radical violence and ultimately the Holocaust.
Decoding Hitler's dictatorship down to its core leads directly to anti-Semitism. From his early rants in the Bavarian beer halls to his final statement in the Berlin bunker, where he railed against the so-called Jewish conspiracy, anti-Semitism is the consistent theme in more than 700 speeches and all of his writings. But he never outlined a definitive policy. He left that to his Nazi henchmen and enforcers.
Hitler himself needs to be seen as above elements of German policy that might be seen as controversial. This is part of his myth as the Führer.
Hitler had effectively created a distance between himself and his loyal foot soldiers. This could permit people who supported the Nazi Party to be able to say to one another, if only Hitler knew what was going on, he would surely put a stop to it. When in fact, of course, the party knew all too well what was going on.
No exploration of Hitler's tyrannical reign could be complete without mentioning the German public as a pillar of support. While it's true that not all Germans supported the Nazi policies, a significant portion either actively collaborated or remained silent in the face of the Third Reich's heinous crimes and atrocities.
It's fair to say that in 1933, Germans are not voting for the Holocaust. What they are voting for, however, is an avowedly anti-Semitic party. In that sense, we have to understand that the Nazi period is not simply a period of Hitler dominating all aspects of society alone. And we do have to recognize that the Nazi Party is not alone in its efforts to rid Germany of Jewry, and the German people also have to understand that they bear part of that guilt.
Bertolt Brecht sagte einmal, das Schicksal des Menschen ist der Mensch. Und das zeigte sich insbesondere während des Nationalsozialismus. Hier sehen wir, zu was der Mensch fähig ist, was Menschen anderen Menschen antun können, im Glauben, eine tolle Idee zu haben, die Idee eines neuen Deutschland, die Idee der Weltrettung. Also die Idee, das war die Vorstellung, rechtfertigt alles. Alle Mittel sind gerechtfertigt für den wunderbaren Zweck, ein neues, tolles, wehrhaftes und prosperierendes Deutschland aufzubauen.
Adolf Hitler's rise from a 30-year-old nobody to supreme murderous continental empire testifies to the appeal of the populist wave he created, manipulated and oversaw, and to the enabling power of the groups that supported him. Decoding Hitler's tyrannical reign serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of underestimating megalomaniacal leaders obsessed with their own greatness. And it's not only Hitler that we should remember. It's the lessons from his evil regime and the consequences of his murderous actions that should alert us to confront hatred, bigotry, and tyranny wherever they may rise.